No matter what kind of music you listen to, I love something you hate. Suzie Q by Dale Hawkins. I feel very passionately about rock and roll. I think rock and roll is one of the greatest things that has ever happened in the history of our society. And just because I like to have fun, I tend to say that rock and roll stopped after 1965. The Beatles killed rock and roll is one of the greatest books I've ever read. I highly recommend it. So there is no rock and roll after the Beatles. I guess the Rolling Stones still exist and they are actually still a rock and roll band. Maybe the Hollies still exist. I hope so. So there's still rock and roll being made, I guess. Don't get in the way of my logic. Rock and roll stopped after the Beatles. So there's 1950s rock and roll and there's 1960s rock and roll. I prefer 1950s rock and roll because it's crazy. So the rock and roll artists of the 1960s were more sophisticated. They had more technology to recreate their sound. They had more ideas. Rock and roll for the 1950s was wild. It was raw. It was immature. And it was just nuts. Like all the stories about teenagers ripping up the movie theaters while they're watching Rock Around the Clock. In my heart, I get it. Like the excitement, the sex, the energy, these like, I'm young and full of emotions I don't understand, and so I'm just gonna tear shit up. I still resonate with that. And musically, I think that rock and roll captures that. Like, I'm a grown-ass adult now. If I saw someone like at a movie theater just like wrecking shit up, I would get out of there. So the people who were actually offended by rock and roll, as now I actually get that too. But I think that rock and roll is so successful at capturing that emotion that I have had in my life. And music is just a form of emotional communication. And so whether a music is good or not is usually how successful it is at delivering that emotional information. And rock and roll did a great job with me. I prefer to hear the amateurs who were excited and enthusiastic and wild and making mistakes. But I don't think that there's any mistakes made in Suzie Q. Suzie Q is pure groove. It is a thrusting of the hips. When they do their little rock and roll yowls before the guitar solos, I completely believe it. Like the Stray Cats, the rock and roll revivalists, whenever they scream before a solo, I'm just like, yeah, that's what you're supposed to do before the solo. I'm sorry, Brian. I think you're cool. I just didn't believe it when you did it. I'm sorry, Mr. Seltzer. I was probably introduced to the song by CCR, Clearwater Creedence Revival. Why is that hard for me to say right now? Clearwater, Clearwater. Credence, I was introduced to the song by Credence, Clearwater. I was introduced to the song by Clearwater Creedence Revival because I was a teenager and I was just exposed to the rock and roll of my parents and I thought it was cool and it was, you know, like vibey. That isn't so cool now. CCR is considered not a cool band, I think, by people who like cool music, which just means that it's time for them to come around. I asked someone who was under 30 if they even knew who that band was, and they're like, no. Which means that someone's gonna go find their record in a free bin and they're gonna listen to it and they're like, oh my god, these songs are amazing. Which they are. And they're gonna be like, oh, this is so cool. And then they're gonna be influenced by it, and there's gonna be like some CCR sounding band 10 years from now in a college town. Anyway, I'm off topic. I learned about this song from CCR, then eventually heard the original version, and 1950s version is simply better. It is like pure gold. That CCR hammered out and made gold foil painting sculptures, which is cool, but the real thing happened in the 1950s.